So thank all of you for joining us this morning. We're gathered to announce the final passage of the Otto Warmbier North Korea Sanctions and Enforcement Act. This bill is now on its way to the White House as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, and we expect the President to sign it. I want to thank my very strong friend and partner in this long effort, Senator Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania, as well as my friends and colleagues, Senator Sherrod Brown, who played a key role as the ranking Democrat on the Banking Committee, and to Rob Portman, who has been steadfast in his support from the beginning. We want to extend our very special appreciation to Fred and Cindy Warmbier, Otto's parents. Following their son's tragic death, the Warmbiers have dedicated themselves to shining a bright light on the gross human rights violations committed by the North Korean regime and to hold that regime accountable for its malign activities. We have named this legislation in memory of their son, Otto. As we all know, the current talks with North Korea have faltered. They have not produced our goal of obtaining a verifiable agreement to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. In fact, the North Korean dictator has continued to carry out nuclear weapons tests and ballistic missiles tests. On Sunday, the North Korean state media announced that they had successfully conducted another test at a satellite launch site aimed at, quote, overpowering the United States nuclear deterrent, unquote. It was the second such test this week. And Pyongyang has ominously promised a, quote, Christmas gift, unquote, if Washington does not meet its demands. So clearly the current strategy is not working. It's important that we tighten the very leaky economic sanctions regime. The United Nations has extensively documented the holes in the current economic sanctions regime, which has continued to allow North Korea to gain access to the international financial system. And during the last 2 years of the talks, a number of countries, especially China, have loosened their enforcement of the sanctions on North Korean banks and businesses and North Korea. In other words, China has looked the other way while their banks and businesses in many instances have continued to do business with the North Korean regime. In fact, 2 days ago, China and Russia both put forward a proposal at the United Nations to ease sanctions on North Korea, which would take us in exactly the wrong direction. So this legislation is very well timed. Rather than easing sanctions and relieving the pressure on North Korea to come to the negotiating table in good faith to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, we need to put teeth in the existing very leaky sanctions regime, and that's exactly what this legislation does. It imposes secondary sanctions on banks or businesses that are doing any kind of business with North Korea, sends a very simple message. If you do any business with North Korea, you will not have access to the United States markets or to other markets because, like the Iran sanctions bill that ultimately brought Iran to the negotiating table, we believe that this bill, by tightening the sanctions regime, will do the same so that we can ultimately accomplish our goal of denuclearizing the North Korean Peninsula. So let me now hand it over to Pat Toomey, who, as I said at the opening, has been vital to making sure that we got this over the finish line. Pat?
Thank you. Let me just say that, Senator Van Hollen, I really appreciate your leadership. This wouldn't have happened without that leadership. You've been great to work with, as have Senators Brown and Portman. It was a bipartisan effort to achieve this, and of course it was absolutely essential to have the support of the Warmbier family, and I'm grateful to them as well. I would also point out this was a fight of over 2 years to get to this point, and it's all about holding North Korea accountable, this regime, this appalling regime in North Korea, accountable for the nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that they have been developing that are a real threat to Americans and to American allies, and to hold this regime accountable for the horrendous and appalling human rights violations, especially what happened to Otto Warmbier. So it's a mandatory sanctions bill, and that's going to strengthen the U.S. negotiating position vis-a-vis North Korea. For decades, we've seen this game where the North Korean regime will insist on some kind of sanctions or financial benefit, make promises about suspending or abandoning its pursuit of nuclear weapons, only later to discover that they were lying all along and they were in fact pursuing the most dangerous weapons that we know of. It seems to me our best chance of changing the path that North Korea is on is with crippling sanctions. The current sanctions regime is not enough, as Senator Van Hollen observed. It is a very leaky system. There are some reports that the North Korean economy in the last couple of years has actually grown, despite the sanctions that are in place. So clearly, we need these secondary sanctions of the Brink Act, the secondary sanctions that will send a very clear message, especially to financial institutions that are facilitating business with North Korean companies. And the message is just, you can do business with North Korea or the United States, but not both. And that shouldn't be a tough choice for too many institutions. So this is overdue. As I said, I am grateful to my colleagues for their steadfast work to get us to this point. I'm grateful to the Warmbier family, and I look forward to ratcheting up the pressure on a really evil regime. Senator Brown.
Pat, thank you. Thank you all. And Senator Portman, my colleague from Ohio, thanks for your work on this, and especially Senators Van Hollen and Toomey for their unrelenting pressure that they put on this Senate and the House to get this done. It took, as Pat said, it took far too long, but it's so clearly the right thing to do. These sanctions send a clear bipartisan signal that the U.S. is serious about maintaining strong economic and diplomatic pressure on North Korea in terms of human rights abuses and in terms of nuclear weapons. These abuses took the life of Cindy's and Fred's son. These abuses, it's why we named our bipartisan legislation after him, to honor his memory and to remind all Americans of what the North Korean regime is capable of doing, and to remind all Americans of the abysmal record on human rights that the North Korean dictatorship has put together, unfortunately. Chris talked about the North Korean missile tests this month, as did Pat, the Christmas gift that they think they are about to give, and why we need to stand up. Standing up to dictators should not be a partisan issue. I don't know if Fred and Cindy are Republicans or Democrats. What I do know is that Fred and Cindy love their son and love this country, and their commitment every hour of every day, of every week, of every month since their son's death has been just an honor to watch and see how they've stood up and fought and never given up in honor of their son. We unite together, the 4 senators here in the Warmbier family with this Senate, unite together to make sure these provisions were included in the NDAA. I'll continue to work through the Banking Committee. Senator Van Hollen sits on that committee too, with the chairman, Mike Crapo, to make sure that we hold this regime accountable. It's who we are and what we need to do. Senator Portman.
First, to thank my colleagues, to Chris Van Hollen and to Pat Toomey. They are very effective legislators, and although it seems like it took forever, they managed to shepherd this through the process. And I appreciate it for 2 reasons. One, their willingness to name it after Otto. And 2, this is the right thing to do, to tighten these sanctions on North Korea, to force them to the bargaining table to deal with the egregious human rights abuses and also the nuclear weapons program they continue to exercise. And to my colleague Sherrod Brown from Ohio, he was ranking on the committee that produced this, but he's also an Ohioan who, in his heart, knows this is the right thing to do because his constituent was the one who was taken prisoner. This is emotional for me because I spent 18 months trying to ensure that young Otto Warmbier, a promising college student from Cincinnati, Ohio, my hometown, was able to be released from captivity. only to find out that the North Korean regime had not only branded him a prisoner of war, by the way, violating the Geneva Convention, but that in fact they had not told the world, including those of us trying to help him to be released back to his family, they had not told us of his medical condition. So for over a year, they hid this from the world. Effectively, they killed Otto Warmbier. So from a human rights perspective, only appropriate that we name this legislation after Otto. The Warmbier family's with us today. Cindy and Fred are dear friends of my wife's and mine. Much more importantly, they are champions now for channeling the grief that they've experienced into something constructive, which is to ensure that the North Korean regime is held accountable. And to my colleagues, what you have done today, I just said this to Cindy, I believe Otto would approve of, because it is an opportunity in a very specific way to tighten sanctions on a regime that not only horribly mistreated their son, but horribly mistreats so many hundreds of thousands of their own citizens and citizens from other countries who have fallen into their grasp. So it is my honor today to be here with Cindy and Fred, to thank them for their tireless pursuit of justice for their son, and to help encourage all of us to be more focused on how to bring North Korea into the civilized world, to ensure that they are held to account for what they have done, and that in the future we can avoid these kinds of egregious human rights abuses. I'm going to ask Cindy and Fred to come up and say a few words. Again, this is an emotional day for all of us here, but a very important one, and I thank the Warmbiers for their steadfast support of efforts here in the United States Congress to try to ensure that North Korea is held to account. Cindy?
I'm Fred Warmbier. I'm Otto's dad. I can't thank the 4 senators here enough for their persistence to make this happen. I am still traumatized by what North Korea did to our family, and certainly what they did to our son. Today, I'm overjoyed at the commitment that these senators have put in their efforts to make a difference in North Korea.
I'm Cindy, and thank you all for being here. And my message is to North Korea, like it always is. People matter. Otto matters. We're never going to let you forget our son. Thank you.
We're happy to take any questions, but let me again thank the Warmbiers. Thank you for being here. Thank you for honoring your son's memory by taking, as Rob said, that awful pain and channeling it in important ways. And you've been doing that in many different ways, including bringing us here today. So thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
Travis Tritton with Bloomberg. Thanks for doing this. Do you have any opinions about what this Christmas gift might be that the North Koreans are talking about? And do you believe that they may be testing another ICBM? And lastly, do you believe that these new sanctions might affect that calculus?
So the short answer is I don't know exactly what they're thinking. You've probably seen the speculation from a senior U.S. Air Force commander who has some insights into their thinking, and his expectation is it may be something like a long-range ICBM test. I think regardless of what their thinking is, we're here together because we think it's important to send a very clear message that we are going to respond to North Korean aggression by further ratcheting up economic pressure so that we can have a serious negotiation and get to a good result for North Korea, South Korea, for the world, for the United States. Yeah.
On the remarks with NHK and broadcasting, on the secondary sanctions on banking institutions, were there any countries in particular that you're concerned about that you had in mind?
I think we have. Go ahead.
Well, I don't think it's any secret that the financial institutions that have been facilitating business with North Korean entities have been mostly in China. So our legislation isn't about singling out a particular country. It's anywhere where these financial institutions exist and they choose to do business that facilitates the economy of North Korea. But there is a reality here. The reality is they're mostly in China.
Yeah.
How effective has President Trump been in bringing North Korea to account for North Korean for their nuclear weapons program and for the Otto Warmbier?
Well, let me respond with respect to the nuclear program. What we know is, as of today, we have not achieved our result. I should make clear that addressing North Korea has been a challenge for multiple administration of both parties. And while I certainly personally have some, serious differences with the way this administration has approached it, I think what brings us here together today is the belief that as we gather here and we listen to the new threats coming from North Korea, it's really important that we send this message and we do it in a unified manner. And I expect that the President will sign this provision as part of the overall NDAA.
Chris, can I make a comment on that? Yeah. We've talked today about the egregious human rights abuses, and we've talked about their nuclear weapons program and many, many concerns we have with North Korea. I will say that, speaking for myself, I'm very pleased that we have a line of communication now with North Korea. And I say that because as we tried to help Otto Warmbier come home to his family, there was no one to talk to. And when the Trump administration came in, to their credit, they did establish a line of communication. And through that effort, the Trump administration, and particularly a couple of very courageous career people at the State Department, and at that time the Deputy Secretary of State, who's now our ambassador to Russia, and the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and the President and Vice President got engaged. And they helped us to bring Otto home. And that should be noted. And I think the Warmbiers would agree with that. So my view is the sanctions, particularly the secondary sanctions that, thanks to these gentlemen behind me, are now going to be part of American law, are incredibly important because our banking system ultimately and the financial system is so critical to the accountability. But I do commend the administration for having a line of communication and for opening that. And again, I certainly saw that in the case of Otto.
I think you're also seeing in the Banking Committee a reassertion of legislative powers in terms of sanctions. There is increasingly broad bipartisan support on sanctions, not just North Korea, but elsewhere in trouble spots around the world, and I think it's an important development.
Yeah.
We have seen Congress pass sanctions legislation before, only for Trump not to implement it, such as what's happening with Turkey and the CASA sanctions. How confident are you that Trump will actually implement these sanctions? And then, I don't know if the Warmbiers are taking any questions, but if you are, I'm wondering if you have any message to the President as North Korea increases their threats again.
Well, we expect the administration to comply with the law that's being passed today, which requires that they impose mandatory sanctions unless they exercise their waiver authority. Like other sanctions bills, this grants the President waiver authority. I think we would all here agree that we hope the President will not exercise that waiver authority unless we see, very concrete moves made by North Korea to, reduce their aggressive actions, and we would also like to see them to, address the awful human rights situation in North Korea. So while this provision does give the President waiver authority, we hope they would only exercise those waivers if there was clear justification.
I would just add that the three of us are members of the Banking Committee, and the Banking Committee has jurisdiction, as Senator Brown observed, for sanctions, and I can assure you, I think I can speak for my colleagues, that we'll be taking our oversight responsibilities very seriously to make sure, as Senator Van Hollen said, that these are in fact imposed unless there is the very, very substantial change in behavior that would merit the waiver. So I think we'll take that responsibility very seriously.
Did you want to say something to me?
As far as a message to the President about how to deal with North Korea, obviously, we didn't do well. I've always said the same thing. Don't make a bad deal, and don't believe a word they say. And nothing's changed.
And I would say not necessarily to the President. Our efforts, we believe that if we enforce the rule of law against North Korea, it's not going to happen inside North Korea, it's going to happen outside of North Korea. And we force them to engage in their criminal enterprises, which they have all over the world. That can lead to engagement with them. It can force dialogue with them. So this banking bill is very important to our efforts because it gives us more tools to force the North Koreans to engage on some level. And I believe that this is ultimately, and again, we're doing this in Berlin now with the closing of a hostel they've run illegally for decades. And they're going to show up in court now, and they're being forced to engage. They're breaking the law. So this, to us, is a great tool, and I think this is the method that can change North Korea's behavior.
Any other questions? If not, it's been a long journey, but I think the timing of this passage is very good and sends the right signal. I want to thank again all my colleagues. All right. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Sharon.
You guys.
Yep.